In the shadowed corners of a world obsessed with power and prestige, Barron Trump emerged as an enigma, a towering figure whose very name carried the weight of a dynasty. Yet, on one fateful day, his quiet ascent collided with a force as unpredictable as a storm breaking over calm waters. A Zelensky fan, fueled by a passion so intense it seemed to ignite the air around him, thrust Barron into a spectacle that would ripple across headlines and hearts alike. This wasn't just a clash of ideals, it was a collision of worlds, one born of privilege, the other forged in fervor. What unfolded was a moment so electrifying, so charged with raw energy, that it defied expectation and demanded attention. This is the tale of that extraordinary encounter, a story poised on the edge of chaos, ready to unravel in ways no one could foresee. The sun dipped low over the sprawling campus of Georgetown University, casting golden hues across brick buildings and manicured lawns. It was late spring, the air thick with the scent of blooming magnolias and the hum of anticipation. Inside the historic Gaston Hall, an audience gathered, their footsteps echoing off polished wood floors. The occasion was a student-led symposium on international relations, and the keynote speaker was none other than Barron Trump, 18 years old, a freshman with a legacy as vast as the room itself. The hall was a cathedral of academia, its high ceilings adorned with intricate frescoes, its pew-like seats filling with a diverse crowd. Students in casual jeans mingled with professors in tweed, their faces alight with curiosity. A massive chandelier hung overhead, its crystals catching the light and scattering it like stars across the walls. At the front, a wooden lectern awaited, flanked by a projector screen displaying the event's title in bold letters, Diplomacy in a Divided World. Backstage, Barron stood in a dimly lit corridor, his silhouette cutting an imposing figure against the exposed brick. At 6'7", he loomed larger than life, his broad shoulders filling out a charcoal blazer. His blonde hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights, swept back with precision, while his piercing blue eyes scanned the room beyond the curtain. In his hands he held a single sheet of paper, his speech, distilled to its essence, a blend of youthful idealism and inherited confidence. This isn't just a story, it's a revelation. And if you want to see how far it goes, subscribe now before it disappears. His presence was magnetic, a quiet intensity radiating from him as he prepared to step into the spotlight. The clock ticked closer to the hour and the hall buzzed with restless energy. The seats were nearly full, the air crackling with whispers and the occasional rustle of programs. Ushers moved silently along the aisles, their eyes darting toward the stage. The lights dimmed, casting the audience into a sea of shadows, and a hush fell as the event's moderator, a wiry senior with a microphone, strode to the lectern. With a brief wave, he signaled the start, and the crowd's attention sharpened. Barron emerged, his long strides carrying him across the stage with an effortless grace. The applause swelled, a wave of sound that crashed against the walls and reverberated through the hall. He reached the lectern, adjusted its height with a deft motion, and let his gaze sweep the room. His posture was erect, his hands steady as he set his paper down. The room seemed to lean toward him, drawn by the unspoken promise of his words. He began, his voice deep and measured, cutting through the silence like a blade. The topic was diplomacy, the challenges of a fractured globe, and the role of youth in mending it. His sentences flowed with a rhythm that held the audience captive, crisp, deliberate, laced with a subtle charisma that belied his age. Heads nodded in the front row, pens scratched across notebooks, and the projector flickered to life behind him, displaying maps and statistics that underscored his points. But in the far corner of the hall, a shadow stirred. A figure stood apart, unnoticed at first, his outline blurred against the wall. He was wiry and lean, his frame draped in a worn leather jacket emblazoned with a yellow and blue patch, the Ukrainian flag, faded but defiant. His name was Viktor Kovalenko, a junior studying history, known among his peers for his late-night rants about justice and geopolitics. His dark hair fell in messy waves over a furrowed brow, and his green eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce the dimness. In his hands, he gripped a folded banner, its edges frayed from use, its message concealed but pulsing with intent. Victor had come with a purpose. For weeks, he'd simmered with frustration, his admiration for Ukraine's leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, clashing with his disdain for the Trump name. To him, Barron wasn't just a student. He was a symbol of wealth, of influence, of a lineage Victor blamed for tilting the world's balance. This symposium, this stage, was his battlefield, and he intended to wage war with the only weapons he had, his voice and his resolve. As Barron's speech gained momentum, Victor edged closer. He moved with a predator's stealth, weaving between seats, his boots silent on the carpeted floor. His pulse quickened, a drumbeat in his chest as he neared the center aisle. The crowd remained oblivious, their eyes fixed on the stage, but the air grew heavier, charged with an unseen tension. Security guards lingered near the exits, their attention drifting, unaware of the storm brewing in their midst. Barron reached a crescendo, his hands gesturing broadly as he spoke of unity across borders. The projector flashed an image of a globe, its continents stitched together by glowing lines. The audience leaned in, captivated, until a rustle broke the spell. Victor had reached the aisle, his banner now unfurled in his grasp, its bold black letters catching the light, "Truth over trust funds." Below the words, a stark graphic depicted a shattered Ukrainian flag, its colors bleeding into a silhouette of a dollar sign. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, heads turning as Victor thrust the banner high. His stance was unyielding, his jaw set, his eyes locked on Barron. The hall erupted into murmurs, a wave of confusion and shock rippling outward. Barron's voice faltered for a fraction of a second, his gaze snapping to the interruption. His hand paused mid-gesture, hovering in the air, as the weight of the moment settled over him. The chandelier's light glinted off Victor's jacket, casting jagged reflections across the room. The guards snapped to attention, their radios crackling as they converged, but the scene was already spiraling beyond their control. Barron stood motionless, his towering frame a pillar against the chaos, his expression unreadable. The audience held its breath, caught between the speaker and the agitator, the air thick with the promise of confrontation. And so the stage was set, not just for a speech but for a reckoning. Two forces, one rooted in legacy, the other in rebellion, faced each other across a divide that felt as vast as the world they sought to define. What would come next was anyone's guess, but one thing was certain: this was only the beginning. The auditorium at Georgetown University was a powder keg, and Viktor Kovalenko had just lit the fuse. His banner, "Truth over Trust Funds," dangled defiantly above the stunned crowd, its imagery, a shattered Ukrainian flag bleeding into a dollar sign, searing itself into the minds of everyone present. The silence that followed its unfurling lasted only a heartbeat before the room erupted into a storm of gasps, murmurs, and the sharp clatter of shifting chairs. Students craned their necks, professors clutched their notes, and a swarm of phone screens lit up as the live stream chat detonated with reactions ranging from outrage to exhilaration. Barron Trump stood at the lectern, his tall frame rigid, his hand frozen mid-gesture as though time itself had paused, his piercing blue eyes fixed on Victor, unblinking, betraying nothing but a faint tightening of his jaw. The projector behind him hummed faintly, its image of a spinning globe now a laughable relic of the speech he'd been delivering moments ago. The audience held its breath, waiting for his reaction. Would he crumble under the ambush or rise to meet it? Security surged into action, their dark uniforms slicing through the crowd like knives. Two guards flanked Victor, their hands hovering near their tasers, while a third scanned the room, barking orders into a crackling radio. The tension spiked as the crowd's phones tilted upward, capturing every second for a global audience. The live stream's viewership soared, comments flooding in, "Hero, disrespectful punk. This is what democracy looks like." But then Barron did something no one expected. He raised a hand, calm, deliberate, and the guards froze mid-step. His voice cut through the chaos, steady and resonant. "Let him speak." The command was simple, but its weight silenced the room. A ripple of shock passed through the audience, their eyes darting between the poised young Trump and the fiery protester. Barron's gaze never wavered from Victor, his expression a challenge. "You've got the floor, use it." Victor faltered for a split second, his breath catching as adrenaline surged through him. His arm still gripped the banner, trembling slightly, but his resolve hardened. He stepped forward, his voice raw and thick with his Ukrainian accent. "You talk of diplomacy, of unity," he began, his words dripping with scorn. "But what do you know of suffering? Your family's empire, your trust funds built on the ruins of places like mine. Ukraine burns, and you stand here playing savior with your silver spoon." The accusation exploded like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed from the front rows, while a knot of students near the back, activists with clenched fists, murmured in agreement. A professor scribbled furiously in his notebook, and a media rep in the corner typed frantically into her phone. Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped away from the lectern, his long strides carrying him down the stage stairs toward Victor. The guards twitched, uncertain, but his presence held them at bay. He stopped just feet from Victor, towering over him, the contrast stark. Barron's polished suit and cool demeanor against Victor's wiry frame and blazing intensity. The air between them crackled, electric with unspoken stakes. "You think yelling in a room changes the world?" Barron asked, his voice low but edged with steel. "You want to talk sacrifice? Go ahead, but don't act like you've got me figured out." Victor's eyes flared, his grip on the banner tightening until his knuckles whitened. "You're a Trump," he spat, stepping closer, his voice rising. "Your name is a cancer, war profiteers, liars. You think a fancy speech erases the blood your family's left behind." He thrust the banner forward, its fabric snapping like a whip, forcing Barron to confront its brutal imagery up close. Barron's gaze flicked to the banner, then back to Victor. A shadow crossed his face, his composure cracking just enough to reveal a flicker of heat. "I don't answer for the past," he said, his tone quieter now but carrying a dangerous edge. "I'm here to build something new. You want to tear it down, prove it's worth more than noise." The crowd stirred, a murmur of surprise threading through the seats. It wasn't the deflection they'd expected, not an apology, not a dismissal, but a dare. Victor's jaw tightened, his fury momentarily thrown off balance. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss audible only to Barron. "Build something new. You can't wash that name clean. It's a curse, and you're fooling yourself if you think otherwise." Barron's eyes narrowed, a glint of defiance or maybe anger flashing in them. He leaned closer, his voice a low growl. "Then watch me try." The standoff teetered on a razor's edge, the room holding its breath as the two men locked wills. But before either could strike the next blow, the tension shattered. A shout erupted from the back, "Free Ukraine," followed by a chorus of voices as a group of students leaped to their feet, fists raised. The chant swelled, ragged and fierce. "Free Ukraine! Free Ukraine!" The activists surged forward, their faces alight with zeal, shoving past stunned onlookers. Security scrambled to react, barking orders as they pushed into the crowd, but the room was spiraling into chaos. Phones flashed like lightning, the live stream spiking as the world tuned in to the unfolding mayhem. A scuffle broke out near the aisle. One guard wrestled with a student waving a Ukrainian flag, while another protester climbed onto a chair, shouting, "No more dynasties." In the center of it all, Barron and Victor remained locked in their silent duel, the pandemonium swirling around them like a storm. The banner slipped from Victor's hand, trampled underfoot as the crowd pressed in. Then, a new voice cut through the noise, a sharp, amplified crackle from the stage. Enough! It was Professor Elena Martinez, a firebrand academic known for her polarizing takes on global politics. She seized the microphone, her dark eyes blazing as she glared out at the chaos. "You want a debate? Then sit down and have it. Or are you all just here for the circus?" Her words hit like a slap and the room faltered, the chants dying into an uneasy murmur. Heads turned, uncertain. Martinez pointed at Barron and Victor. "You two, on stage. Now, the world's watching, so make it count." The crowd buzzed, a mix of anticipation and disbelief. Barron's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze flicking to Martinez, then back to Victor. Victor's chest heaved, his fists clenched, but a spark of something pride maybe flared in his eyes. Security hesitated, looking to Barron for a signal, but he gave none. Instead, he turned and strode back toward the stage, his silence louder than any command. Victor followed, his steps heavy with defiance, the crumpled banner left behind like a battle flag on a field. The audience settled, some reluctantly, others eagerly, as the two men took their places under the harsh stage lights. Martinez stood between them, a reluctant referee in a fight no one had scripted. "This isn't a shouting match," she said, her voice sharp. "It's a reckoning. Barron, you claim you're here to build. Victor, you say he can't escape his legacy. Prove it, both of you." The room went still, the weight of her challenge sinking in. Barron adjusted his tie, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, confidence or provocation, it was hard to tell. Victor cracked his knuckles, his stare burning with unspent fury. The livestream chat exploded anew, bets and barbs flying as the world leaned in. What came next would be no ordinary debate. It was a collision of worlds, privilege versus pain, idealism versus inheritance, and the fallout would ripple far beyond these walls. The auditorium lights dimmed slightly as the crowd dispersed, their voices a low rumble echoing off the high ceilings. Barron Trump and Viktor Kovalenko remained on stage, the tension between them still palpable but softened by the weight of their closing words. Professor Elena Martinez stepped back, her role as moderator complete, though her keen eyes lingered on the two young men. The university chancellor, her silver hair glinting under the spotlight, had retreated to the wings, leaving the stage to its two protagonists. The livestream continued to hum, phones still raised by stragglers capturing every moment, the chat alive with speculation about what came next. Barron adjusted his tie, a subtle gesture that betrayed a flicker of unease. He glanced at Victor, who stood rigid, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The applause had faded, but the air crackled with unfinished business. Neither man moved to leave. It was as if the debate's end had only sharpened their resolve to understand, or perhaps challenge, each other further. From the edge of the stage, a lone voice broke the silence. It was the young woman from the front row, her notepad clutched in one hand, her expression a mix of curiosity and boldness. "Mr. Trump, Mr. Kovalenko," she called, her voice steady despite the hundreds of eyes turning toward her. "You've talked about proving yourselves. What's your next step? Right now, not some vague future." The question hung in the air, a spark igniting the embers of the debate. The crowd hushed, leaning in once more. Barron's lips curved into a faint, thoughtful smile, while Victor's brow furrowed, his gaze shifting to the woman with reluctant intrigue. Barron spoke first, stepping forward to the edge of the stage. "Right now," he echoed, his tone measured but carrying a new edge of determination. "I'm heading back to the drawing board, literally. I've been working on a proposal for a nonprofit focused on educational equity, starting with pilot programs in places like Eastern Europe and rural America. It's not just talk. I've got meetings lined up next week with potential partners, NGOs, not politicians. The goal is to get it off the ground within 6 months." A ripple of surprise passed through the remaining audience. The livestream chat flared with reactions. "Is he serious? Sounds like PR spin. Eastern Europe, that's bold." Barron paused, his eyes finding the woman who'd asked. "It's not about my name or my family's money. It's about proving utility, results over rhetoric." Victor let out a sharp, skeptical laugh, uncrossing his arms. 6 months, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you can waltz into Kiev or Kharkiv with your pilot programs and fix decades of neglect? You'll need more than meetings, Trump. You'll need to face the people who have lived it, people like me." He turned to the woman, his intensity undimmed. "My next step, I'm organizing. There's a coalition forming, students, activists, displaced voices from Ukraine and beyond. We're drafting demands, not proposals. Next month we march here in DC, in Brussels if we can. Change doesn't wait for your timeline, it fights for air every day. The contrast was stark and the crowd felt it. Barron's calculated pragmatism clashed with Victor's raw urgency, yet both answers carried a thread of sincerity that kept the room riveted. The woman nodded, scribbling notes, then pressed further. "And will you work together, or is this just more posturing?" The question landed like a grenade. Barron and Victor locked eyes, the silent battle reigniting. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of their earlier exchange, rage, defiance, and that fleeting glimpse of mutual recognition, hanging between them. Barron broke the silence, his voice low but firm. "I'd work with anyone who's serious about results. Victor's got passion, I respect that, but I don't do marches, I do plans. If he's got data, not just demands, I'm listening." Victor's jaw tightened, his response a growl. "And I don't trust plans from people who have never lost. You want my data? Earn it. Come to Kiev. See the rubble, talk to the widows. Then we'll see if your nonprofit's worth a damn." The challenge was unmistakable, a gauntlet thrown not just at Barron but at the watching world. The live stream spiked again, viewers flooding in as clips of the exchange went viral. The woman lowered her notepad, satisfied, and slipped back into the thinning crowd. But her question had shifted something, planted a seed that neither man could ignore. Martinez reemerged, sensing the moment's gravity. "You've got your answers," she said to the room, her tone crisp. "Now it's up to them and us to see what they do with it." She gestured to the exits, signaling the end, but her eyes lingered on Barron and Victor, a scientist observing a volatile reaction. As the last of the audience trickled out, Barron extended a hand toward Victor, not a handshake, but a gesture to the side, an invitation to step off stage together. "Kiev's a long way," he said quietly, almost too low for the mics to catch. "But I've got a plane." Victor stared at the hand, then at Barron, his expression unreadable. After a beat, he smirked, a sharp, grudging twist of his lips. "Keep your plane. I'll get there my way. But if you show up, don't expect a welcome mat." With that, he turned and strode off stage, his boots echoing in the now empty hall. Barron watched him go, a flicker of something, respect perhaps or anticipation crossing his face. He followed a moment later, his steps deliberate, the weight of the night settling into his broad shoulders. The live stream cut out, but the story didn't. Outside, the campus buzzed with debate, students clustering in knots, dissecting every word, while online forums lit up with analysis. Barron Trump and Viktor Kovalenko had left the stage, but their collision had sparked a fire that wouldn't fade. The world watched, waiting for the next move as two paths diverged, and yet somehow seemed destined to converge again. The weeks following the Georgetown debate were a whirlwind for Barron Trump and Viktor Kovalenko, their lives diverging yet tethered by the unresolved tension of their public clash. Barron holed up in a modern office in downtown Washington, D.C., its glass walls reflecting the city's skyline as he worked tirelessly on his nonprofit, now called Bridges Beyond Borders. The initiative aimed to fund education projects in conflict zones, with pilot programs planned for Ukraine and rural America. Surrounded by a small team, policy enthusiasts, nonprofit experts, and a seasoned diplomat, he mapped out budgets, drafted proposals, and fielded calls from curious NGOs and probing reporters. His days bled into nights, fueled by ambition and the quiet determination to prove his idea could stand on its own. Across town, Victor transformed his cramped dorm into a command center. Maps of D.C. and protest plans covered the walls, while his coalition, students from Georgetown, Howard, and other campuses, grew louder and more organized. Their first major demonstration was scheduled on the National Mall, timed to disrupt an international summit and amplify their demands for Ukraine. Victor's voice cracked from endless meetings, his energy sustained by a mix of coffee and conviction. He'd brushed off Barron's playful offer of a plane to Kiev, but the memory of their exchange gnawed at him, sharpening his resolve. Then, on a chilly October morning, an unexpected twist arrived. An invitation from the Ukrainian embassy. For Barron, it came in an elegant, embossed envelope slipped under his office door. For Victor, a terse email buried in his inbox. The occasion was a private gala at the embassy's residence near the capital, honoring advocates for Ukraine's reconstruction. Barron's nonprofit pitch and Victor's vocal activism had earned them both a spot, not just as attendees, but as honorees. You felt that, didn't you? That was no ordinary moment. If it hit you, hit like and let's keep going. For Barron, it was a golden opportunity to win over influential backers. For Victor, a chance to confront power face to face. Neither could decline, though both sensed the collision course ahead. The gala unfolded in the embassy's lavish ballroom, aglow with chandeliers and draped in Ukraine's blue and yellow colors. Guests, diplomats, philanthropists, and a few camera-ready celebrities mingled around tables piled with caviar and champagne, their chatter underscored by a string quartet. Barron arrived in a sharp tuxedo, his towering frame cutting through the crowd with an ease born of privilege. He worked the room, shaking hands with donors and dodging questions about his father's shadow, his focus fixed on securing support for his nonprofit. His eyes scanned the sea of faces, anticipating Victor's inevitable arrival. Victor stormed in late, his usual leather jacket traded for a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit. His scuffed boots clashed with the polished marble, and his expression, half defiance, half disdain, drew stares. A crumpled speech, rewritten a dozen times, weighed down his pocket. His coalition had drilled him, make noise but don't alienate everyone. Yet seeing Barron glide among the elite reignited his frustration, a spark ready to catch fire. The night's program kicked off with polished remarks from embassy officials, praising Ukraine's spirit and its allies' generosity. Then came the main event. Barron and Victor were summoned to the stage, introduced as two bold voices for a new generation of solidarity. The applause was warm but wary. Word of their debate had spread, and the room buzzed with anticipation. Barron stepped up first, his tone calm and measured. He outlined bridges beyond borders with precision, rebuilding schools, funding scholarships, empowering communities torn by war. He sidestepped his last name, letting the vision speak for itself. The crowd responded with approving nods, though some glanced at Victor, sensing the storm brewing. When Victor grabbed the microphone, his hands shook, but his words cut like glass. "Solidarity isn't tuxedos and toasts," he said, his accent heavy with emotion. "It's not blueprints from an ivory tower. It's the mother in Mariupol with no food, the fighter in Donetsk with no legs. You want to help? Hear us, not just him." He jabbed a finger at Barron, his stare unflinching. Don't let his money dazzle you into forgetting the real stakes. The ballroom froze, the air thick with unease. Barron's face hardened, his fists clenching, but he held his tongue. A few guests squirmed, others leaned in, hooked by the drama. The embassy's cultural attaché, a poised woman with silver hair, intervened with a strained smile. "Thank you, Mr. Kovalenko, for your fervor," she said, her voice firm. "We cherish all perspectives here." Victor pressed on, pulling a battered photo from his pocket, a snapshot of a shattered school in Kharkiv. He thrust it into the air. "This is your solidarity," he declared, his voice climbing. "Not here, but there in the rubble. If you're for real, Barron, come see it. Come with me. Or admit this is all a rich kid's game." Words hit like a thunderclap, the photo fluttering to the floor as the room held its breath. Barron's mind raced, sidestep, deflect, or dive in. The weight of every stare, every hidden phone recording the moment, bore down on him. But beneath it, a deeper urge stirred, to silence the doubters, to show he was more than a name. He stepped closer to Victor, his voice quiet but resonant. "You want me in Kharkiv? Done. I'll go, not for your march, not for your cameras, but to build something that lasts. Watch me." Victor faltered, surprised by the answer. His arm dropped, the fire in his eyes flickering with uncertainty. After a beat, he nodded slowly. "Prove it," he said under his breath, retreating a step. "We'll see." The crowd exhaled, a ripple of shock spreading as the attaché herded them off stage, the quartet scrambling to fill the silence. The gala lurched back to life, but the moment lingered, already leaking beyond the ballroom's walls. By dawn, the headlines blared. Trump scion takes Ukrainian dare and activist calls Barron's bluff, he bites. Social media exploded, dissecting every word, every frame. For Barron and Victor, the stakes had soared. A trip to Kharkiv now loomed, a crucible that would test their principles, their nerve, and the thin thread of mutual respect tying them together. The world waited, hungry for what came next. The hotel's thin walls did little to muffle the sounds of Kharkiv at night: distant sirens, the occasional rumble of a passing vehicle, the murmur of voices from the street below. Barron Trump lay on his narrow bed, the coarse blanket pulled up to his chest, his eyes fixed on a jagged crack in the ceiling. Sleep eluded him. The day's images replayed in relentless loops: the shattered school, Olna's steady voice, the smudged sunflower drawing pinned to a broken wall. Each moment pressed against his resolve, testing the edges of his carefully constructed purpose. Across the hall, Viktor Kovalenko paced his own small room, his boots thudding softly against the worn floorboards. His mind churned with a tangle of frustration and adrenaline. He wanted Barron to see this, to feel the weight of Ukraine's struggle. But the reality of having him here, this golden-haired heir with his polished ideals, gnawed at him. Was this a victory for his cause, or a mistake that would dilute it into a footnote of Barron's personal redemption arc? He stopped by the window, peering through a gap in the threadbare curtains at the darkened city beyond, its scars invisible but omnipresent. Morning arrived too soon, gray light filtering through the grime-streaked windows. The two men met in the hotel's cramped lobby, their faces etched with fatigue but their postures rigid with determination. Barron wore a dark jacket over a simple sweater, his sunglasses tucked into a pocket. Victor sported a faded hoodie beneath his coat, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. They exchanged a glance, brief, loaded, unspoken, and headed for the convoy waiting outside. The drive to the front lines was a descent into a different world. The road out of Kharkiv grew rougher, its asphalt pocked with blast marks and hastily patched craters. The landscape shifted from urban decay to rural desolation. Fields lay fallow, dotted with the husks of abandoned machinery. Villages huddled in silence, their rooftops sagging or gone entirely. Checkpoints multiplied, manned by soldiers with weathered faces and rifles slung across their chests. Each stop brought terse exchanges in Ukrainian, Victor translating with clipped efficiency while Barron watched, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on his knee. Their destination was a staging area just beyond the heaviest fighting, a compromise between Victor's push for raw exposure and the security team's insistence on safety. The convoy rolled to a stop at a muddy outpost ringed with sandbags and razor wire. The air hummed with tension, distant artillery thumped like a heartbeat, and the sharp crack of small arms fire echoed intermittently. Soldiers moved with purpose, their uniforms streaked with dirt, their eyes scanning the horizon. A Ukrainian officer, Captain Mykola Atritsenko, met them at the perimeter. He was broad-shouldered, his face lined beyond his years, his handshake firm but brief. "You're here to see," he said in accented English, his tone neither welcoming nor hostile. "Good, but you stay where I say or you leave in bags." His gaze lingered on Barron, sizing him up, then flicked to Victor with a flicker of recognition, perhaps from activist circles, perhaps from the news. The tour began with a walk through the outpost. Mykola pointed out the essentials: a field hospital tent where medics stitched wounds by lantern light, a row of battered vehicles patched with scavenged parts, a makeshift command post buzzing with radio chatter. Barron absorbed it all, his notebook filling with scribbled observations: supply shortages, medical needs, morale. Victor listened too, but his attention was elsewhere, tracking the soldiers' faces, the exhaustion etched into their movements. They paused at an observation point, a low rise overlooking a stretch of contested ground. Through binoculars, Barron saw trenches snaking through the earth, their edges jagged with barbed wire and debris. Smoke curled from a distant village, its silhouette fractured by shelling. The reality of war, so often reduced to headlines and statistics, unfolded in stark, unfiltered detail. He lowered the binoculars, his breath shallow, his usual composure fraying at the edges. Victor stood beside him, his own binoculars untouched. "This is what your aid packages don't show," he said, his voice cutting through the wind. "The people in those trenches, they're not numbers. They're sons, fathers, sisters, and every day you debate, they die." Barron's grip tightened on the binoculars, his knuckles whitening. "I'm not debating," he snapped, turning to face Victor. "I'm here, I'm seeing it. What more do you want from me?" "More than photo ops," Victor shot back, stepping closer. "You've got power, real power back home. Use it. Push your government, your family's allies. Get us what we need to win, not just survive." Barron's eyes narrowed, a storm brewing behind them. "You think I can snap my fingers and fix this? It's not that simple. I'm not my father. I don't control the world." "Then why are you here?" Victor's voice rose, drawing a glance from Mykola nearby. "To feel good, to tell your donors you tried. This," he gestured to the scarred landscape, "this isn't a project you can finish and walk away from." "I'm not walking away," Barron said, his tone low and fierce. "I'm starting something, schools, clinics, infrastructure. It's not everything, but it's what I can do. You want to tear it down before it's even built." Victor's jaw clenched, his fists balling at his sides. "And while you build your schools, they bomb them again. You're treating symptoms. I'm fighting the disease." Mykola intervened before the argument spiraled further, his voice calm but firm. "Enough, you want to help? Listen." He pointed to the horizon. "Those men need ammo today, not promises tomorrow. Argue later, see now." The rebuke silenced them both, though the tension simmered beneath the surface. They followed Mykola to a trench line just within the outpost's defenses, crouching low as he introduced a young soldier named Taras. Barely 20, Taras had a boyish grin despite the grime on his face and the rifle slung over his shoulder. He spoke in rapid Ukrainian, Victor translating. Stories of holding the line, of friends lost, of a stubborn hope that kept him going. Barron listened, his earlier fire replaced by a quiet intensity, his pen still as Taras's words sank in. The visit ended abruptly when a radio crackled with reports of incoming drones. Mykola barked orders, and the convoy hustled back to the SUVs, engines roaring to life. The drive back to Kharkiv was silent, Barron staring out at the passing devastation, Victor lost in his own thoughts. The front lines had stripped away their posturing, leaving raw questions neither could fully answer. Back at the hotel, they parted without a word, retreating to their rooms. Barron sat at a rickety desk, drafting proposals with a fervor he hadn't felt before, tangible plans for aid, not just platitudes. Victor stood by his window again, replaying Mykola's words, wrestling with the limits of his own fight. The trip had one day left, Kyiv awaited, with meetings that could shape their next steps. But the front lines had changed them, sharpened their edges, and set a collision course neither could avoid. Tomorrow would test them further, and the world would be watching. The Kyiv night deepened, casting long shadows over the city as Barron Trump and Viktor Kovalenko went their separate ways. Barron strode toward his hotel, the glow of streetlights reflecting off the polished marble of the lobby as he entered. Victor, meanwhile, slipped into a dimly lit cafe, where the murmur of voices and the clatter of cups greeted him. His coalition, a ragtag group of volunteers, activists, and former soldiers, sat huddled around a table strewn with maps and half-empty coffee mugs. Both men carried the weight of their newly forged alliance, a fragile bridge built on necessity rather than trust. In his hotel room, Barron tossed his jacket over a chair and loosened his tie, the day's tension still coiled in his shoulders. The view from his window framed Kyiv's skyline, golden domes piercing the dark, a city defiant yet weary. He pulled out his laptop, the screen flickering to life with spreadsheets and emails. His father's text lingered in his mind. Don't let him steal the show. It was classic Donald, part encouragement, part warning, but Barron wasn't here for the spotlight. He'd seen the hollowed-out schools in Kharkiv, the kids with eyes too old for their years. This was bigger than ego. He opened a draft email to his contacts at Bridges Beyond Borders. outlining the deal with Victor. Trucks loaded with medical supplies and building materials would roll out within 48 hours, funded by his foundation. Victor's people would handle distribution, boots on the ground, no delays. In return, Barron's team would fast-track the school projects, with Victor's volunteers pitching in on construction. Olna, the schoolteacher from Kharkiv, would oversee it all, ensuring the aid didn't vanish into the chaos. His fingers paused over the keyboard. Could he trust Victor? The guy was a loose cannon, brash, impulsive, with a chip on his shoulder the size of Donbass. But Barron had seen the fire in him, the kind that got things done when plans faltered. He hit send, then leaned back, staring at the ceiling. This wasn't how he'd envisioned it, sharing control with a rival, but Olna's words echoed. If you can't bridge your own gap, how can you bridge ours? She was right. He'd make it work. At the cafe, Victor slumped into a chair, his coalition eyeing him with a mix of curiosity and impatience. "Well," asked Petro, a burly ex-soldier with a scarred cheek, "what's the rich kid bringing to the table?" Victor smirked, lighting a cigarette despite the glare from a barista. "Trucks, supplies, cash, enough to get us moving tomorrow." A murmur of approval rippled through the group, though Petro's grunt was skeptical. "And the catch?" he pressed. "No catch," Victor said, exhaling smoke. "He wants schools built fast. We help, he pays. Olna keeps us honest." The name drew nods. They'd all met her, seen her quiet strength. She was one of them, not some suit from abroad. Sasha, a wiry volunteer with a laptop balanced on her knees, looked up. "Can we trust him? His family's not exactly known for charity." Victor's jaw tightened. He asked himself the same thing. Barron Trump was a walking contradiction, polished but earnest, privileged yet willing to get his hands dirty. That handshake in the meeting room had felt real, but trust, that was a luxury Victor couldn't afford. "We don't trust," he said finally. "We use. He delivers, we deliver. He doesn't, we walk." The group accepted that, diving into logistics. Routes were mapped, teams assigned. Victor's mind drifted to Barron's offer, no strings, just results. It gnawed at him. Was it a power play dressed as generosity? Or did the guy actually get it? Either way, Victor wouldn't let him call the shots. This was their fight, their country. By morning, the plan sprang to life. Barron's trucks rumbled into a warehouse on Kiev's outskirts, loaded with bandages, antibiotics, and prefab walls for schoolrooms. Victor's coalition swarmed the site, unloading crates with practiced efficiency. Barron arrived in a black SUV, stepping out in a windbreaker instead of a suit, a nod to the fieldwork ahead. Victor met him with a curt nod, no pleasantries wasted. Olna was there too, clipboard in hand, her presence a steadying force. "Supplies to the east first," she said, pointing to a map. "Kharkiv's clinics are desperate, then we start the school foundations." Barron and Victor agreed, their voices overlapping in rare sync. For a moment, the rivalry faded, replaced by a shared rhythm. The day blurred into a flurry of motion, trucks dispatched, volunteers briefed, calls made. Barron worked the phones, securing extra fuel from a donor in Poland. Victor hauled crates alongside his team, barking orders in Ukrainian. Olna darted between them, translating needs into action. By dusk, the first convoy rolled out, headlights cutting through the haze toward the front lines. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Barron and Victor stood outside the warehouse, dust clinging to their clothes. The silence between them was heavy but not hostile. "Your people move fast," Barron said, breaking it. "They have to," Victor replied, lighting another cigarette. "You're not bad with a phone." Barron chuckled, the sound rough with fatigue. "Learned from the best." He didn't elaborate, but Victor guessed who he meant. They watched the last truck vanish down the road, its taillights fading into the dusk. "This changes nothing," Victor said, his tone flat. "We're not friends." "Didn't ask to be," Barron shot back, but his eyes held a glint of respect. "Just don't screw me on the schools." "Don't screw me on the supplies," Victor countered. They didn't shake on it, too much history for that, but the words sealed their truce, at least for now. Olna approached, her face etched with exhaustion but lit by a faint hope. "First day done," she said. The kids in Kharkiv will sleep better tonight. Barron and Victor exchanged a look, not quite a smile, but close. The path ahead was treacherous, their alliance a tightrope over a chasm of distrust. But for the first time, they'd moved forward together, the weight of Ukraine's future binding them tighter than they'd admit. It began with a rumor whispered among Victor's volunteers. Barron, just here for the cameras. The accusation spread quickly, fueled by the inescapable weight of Barron's last name. Victor dismissed it at first. He'd seen Barron work tirelessly, hauling crates alongside the team, but the seed of doubt took root. Was this all a publicity stunt for the Trump legacy? Barron felt the strain too. His phone buzzed with messages from D.C. Donors praising his efforts, his father urging him to keep the spotlight. But he was drowning in expectations. He hadn't come to Ukraine to play politics, yet the game clung to him like damp earth. The tension erupted on a cold morning in Kyiv's warehouse district. The convoy was gearing up for its biggest run yet, medical supplies for a field hospital near the front, but Barron's trucks were late. Victor paced, his frustration boiling over as Barron approached. "Your trucks," Victor snapped. "Where are they? People are dying out there." "They're coming," Barron replied, voice tight. Border traffic snarled. "Traffic?" Victor's laugh was bitter. "That's your excuse. Tell that to the medics with empty hands." Barron bristled. "I'm not the one clogging your roads. Take it up with your people." Victor stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "My people? You mean the ones bleeding for this war while your country waffles?" "I'm here, Victor," Barron shot back. "What more do you want?" "Results," Victor said, his voice like steel. "Not promises." Olna stepped in before fists could fly. "Stop it, both of you. The trucks will arrive. Focus on the plan." They separated, but the air crackled with unresolved anger, a fault line exposed. 2 days later, the rift deepened. The convoy, laden with vital supplies, was ambushed en route. Masked attackers, mercenaries or looters, hit fast, stripping the trucks bare and leaving the drivers battered. Word reached Kyiv by noon, igniting chaos. Victor's team raged about security failures. Barron's staff scrambled to salvage what they could. In the warehouse office, the confrontation was inevitable. "This is your mess," Victor growled, slamming a fist on the desk. "Your foundation skimped on guards." "We had guards," Barron countered, his patience fraying. "They were outnumbered. You think I planned this?" "Doesn't matter," Victor said. "It's on you now." Barron leaned forward. "We'll replace the supplies, double the security. What's your solution, yelling at me?" Victor sneered, throwing money at it, typical. Olna's voice cut through the heat. "Enough. Victor, your team knows the routes. Help us reroute. Barron, get more guards and dig into who hit us." They agreed reluctantly, but the trust between them hung by a thread. That night, as Barron wrestled with logistics in his hotel room, a knock startled him. At the door stood a wiry man in his 50s, gray hair, sharp eyes, a folder tucked under his arm. "I'm Dmitro," he said in clipped English. "Olna sent me." Barron frowned. "For what?" "To fix this," Dmitro replied, stepping inside. "I'm ex-intelligence. That ambush wasn't random." Barron's pulse quickened. "What do you know?" Dmitro spread photos across the desk, blurry shots of men in tactical gear. "Local muscle, but they're hired. Someone wants your aid stopped." "Who?" Barron pressed. "Could be Russian proxies," Dmitro said. "Could be corrupt insiders, could be," he paused, "someone you trust." Barron's mind spun. "You're saying it's one of ours." "Or Victor," Dmitro said. "We find out together. Olna vouches for you, I vouch for her. Deal." Barron nodded, the stakes sinking in. "What's the move?" "A trap," Dmitro said, a glint in his eye. "We bait them. You ready to play dirty?" For 48 hours, Barron and Dmitro worked in the shadows. They leaked false intel, a decoy shipment of high-value supplies, while keeping Victor's team out of the loop. The decision gnawed at Barron, but Dmitro insisted. No risks until the mole was caught. The trap snapped shut on a moonless night. The decoy convoy rolled out, tracked by Dimitro's ex-soldier crew. From a hilltop, Barron watched as the attackers struck, only to be ambushed themselves. Shots rang out, chaos erupted, and soon the assailants were bound and dragged back to the warehouse. Under floodlights, the masks came off. Barron's breath caught Andrew, a quiet kid from his logistics team, stared back, trembling. Beside him was Petro, a scarred veteran from Victor's coalition, his glare defiant. Victor arrived, his face paling at Petro's betrayal. "You," he rasped. Petro spat. "You're blind, both of you. This war's a gravy train, I took my cut." Barron turned to Andrew. "Why?" "They paid me," Andrew mumbled. "Said it was for Ukraine, I didn't." "Save it," Dimitro barked. "Police will sort you out." As the traitors were hauled away, Barron and Victor stood in the cold, the silence heavy. "I missed it," Victor said, voice low. "We both did," Barron replied. "But we caught them, that's what counts." Victor met his gaze. "Still in." "Still in," Barron said, the pact renewed but brittle. The night closed with a bitter victory. Their alliance had survived a brutal test, but the scars ran deep. Trust was a battlefield commodity, and they just spent a fortune to keep it. Ahead loomed bigger fights, and a question neither dared voice. Who else was waiting to strike? The Kyiv dawn broke cold and gray, casting a pale light over the city's scarred skyline. Barron Trump and Viktor Kovalenko stood outside the warehouse, the air thick with the smell of diesel and damp earth. The sting operation they'd orchestrated had succeeded, but it had come at a cost, trust shattered by sabotage and betrayal from within their ranks. The traitors, including Victor's once loyal ally Petro, were gone, hauled off by Ukrainian authorities, leaving behind a bruised but intact alliance between the two men. Exhaustion hung heavy, yet there was a quiet strength in their shared survival. Barron zipped his jacket against the biting chill, his breath fogging in the crisp morning air. He glanced at Victor, who leaned against a crate, his face shadowed by fatigue and a flicker of something deeper, perhaps doubt, or the weight of lessons carved out of chaos. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence no longer laced with hostility but filled with unspoken understanding. "You didn't have to stay," Victor said at last, his voice rough from sleepless nights. "After the ambush, after Petro turned, most would have bolted." Barron shrugged, hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I'm not most people." He paused, then added, "Neither are you." Victor's lips twitched into a faint, bitter smile. "That's the closest you've come to a compliment." Barron chuckled, the sound low and worn. "Don't get used to it." They fell quiet again, watching as the first trucks of the day rumbled to life, their engines cutting through the stillness. Olna emerged from the warehouse, her clipboard tucked under her arm, her face etched with the same weariness they all carried. She'd been their steady hand through the storm, and now, with the worst behind them, she looked ready to collapse. "You two should rest," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "The next convoy sorted, go home." "Home," Victor repeated, the word sounding distant, almost foreign. He glanced at Barron. "Where? That for you now." Barron's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the sun was just beginning to break through the clouds. "DC, I suppose, but I'll be back. The schools aren't done yet." Victor nodded, unsurprised. "And I'll be here making sure they don't get blown up again." It wasn't a jab, just a stark truth, a nod to the fragile reality they'd both come to grasp. Barron's nonprofit, Bridges Beyond Borders, had planted roots in Ukraine, its mission to build schools now a tangible lifeline. Victor's coalition, battered but unbroken, would keep pushing, their fight sharpened by the sting of betrayal and the need for vigilance. Olna stepped closer, her eyes moving between them. "You've both changed," she said softly. "Maybe not how you planned, but it's there. Don't let it go to waste." Her words landed like a quiet challenge. Barron and Victor exchanged a glance, feeling the truth settle in. They arrived in Ukraine as opposites, Barron with his polished privilege, Victor with his rough-edged defiance, but the crucible of war had reshaped them. Barron had seen his wealth and name tested against raw necessity, learning he could stand firm when it mattered. Victor had discovered that not every outsider sought to exploit, that a partnership could outlast pride. "I didn't think you'd last a week," Victor admitted, his tone grudging but honest. "But you stuck it out, didn't flinch when it got messy." Barron met his eyes. "You didn't either, even when your own guy stabbed you in the back." Victor's jaw tightened at the mention of Petro, the wound still fresh. "Trust's a luxury around here, but we made it work." "We did," Barron said, "and we'll keep making it work." Olna smiled, a rare warmth breaking through her fatigue. "Then maybe there's hope for us all." Later that day, Barron stood at Kiev's airport, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his phone buzzing with messages from D.C. donors, reporters, his father. He ignored them for now, his thoughts lingering on the warehouse, on Victor and Olna, on the kids who'd soon have classrooms again. He promised to return in a month to oversee the next phase of construction, but first, he'd face the world back home, a world eager to spin his story into soundbites and scandals. Meanwhile, Victor sat in a cramped office above the cafe where his coalition gathered. A map of the front lines lay spread before him, his fingers tracing the routes they'd fought to secure. The sting operation had exposed weaknesses, but it had also opened doors. Dimitro, the ex-intelligence officer, had offered to train his team in counter-sabotage tactics. They'd be sharper now, more prepared. And Barron's foundation would keep the supplies coming as long as they held their ground. He leaned back, lighting a cigarette, the smoke curling upward. He'd never say it out loud, but Barron had earned his respect, not as a friend, but as a partner who'd stood in the same dirt and taken the same risks. Their rivalry hadn't faded. It had grown into something tougher, a mutual reliance forged in fire. In D.C., Barron stepped off the plane into a swarm of cameras and shouted questions. His father's text lit up his screen. "Welcome home, kid. You made noise. Good." But Barron didn't feel like a kid anymore. He'd seen too much, fought too hard. At the press conference that followed, he brushed aside politics and legacy, speaking instead of Ukraine's grit, the people he'd met, the work still ahead. When a reporter asked about Victor, he paused, then said, "He's a fighter. We need more like him." In Kiev, Victor caught the clip on his phone, a smirk tugging at his lips. He'd braced for Barron to claim the spotlight, but the guy had surprised him again. He stubbed out his cigarette and turned to his team. "Back to work," he said. "We've got schools to build." Months later, the first school in Kharkiv stood proud, its walls adorned with painted sunflowers, Ukraine's symbol of defiance. Barron and Victor stood side by side at the opening ceremony, hands still dusty from the final touches. Olna cut the ribbon, her smile a bright spot against the winter sky. The world had shifted its gaze to fresher headlines, but here, in this scarred corner of a war-torn land, something lasting had taken hold. Barron and Victor would never be friends, too much history, too many divides, but they'd built a bridge, not just of concrete and steel, but of shared struggle and reluctant trust. As they walked away, Barron glanced at Victor. "See you at the next one." Victor nodded, "If you can keep up." Barron laughed, the sound echoing across the empty playground. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, but they'd walk it together in their own stubborn way. If you enjoyed this story, there's another video on screen right now. Go ahead and give it a look for an even more astonishing tale. And don't forget, we'll have many more uplifting and dramatic stories coming your way. So make sure you subscribe to our channel, that way you'll never miss our newest uploads.